Some people will be dying in 30 years in Canada because we have not been responsible today.
Quote, in my view, climate change is the most severe problem that we are facing today, more severe even than terrorism. And I agree.
And what Kyoto was an acknowledgement that the rich countries are using far more of their share of the atmosphere.
This government still has no action plan. During their 8 years of dithering, CO2 emissions have skyrocketed.
We are facing a global crisis, Mr. Speaker. It is transforming the very planet in which we live.
Any delay in ratifying Kyoto means that our lack of courage will be paid for by future generations.
There are no short-term answers, but to fight it, this government will use every tool available.
We will decrease megatons, Mr. Speaker, of CO2, and we would make megatons of money with it, Mr. Speaker.
I used to agree with these dramatic warnings of climate disaster. I taught my students that most of the increase in temperature of the past century was due to human contributions of CO2. The association seemed so clear and simple. Increases of greenhouse gases were driving us towards a climate catastrophe. However, a few years ago I decided to look more closely at the science, and it astonished me. In fact, there is no evidence of humans being the cause. There is, however, overwhelming evidence of natural causes, such as changes in the output of the sun. This has completely reversed my views on the Kyoto Protocol. Actually, many other leading climate researchers also have serious concerns about the science underlying the protocol. So let's hear what you're not being told about climate change.
The field of climate science is vast, and I should emphasize rapidly evolving. Many things we thought we knew about the climate system just a few years ago are now proving to be highly uncertain or quite mistaken.
A common misconception amongst the general public is that temperatures are rapidly increasing. This is only with some of the surface data, and it's selected surface data. In fact, if much of the surface data that's collected is from around urban areas or areas which have had significant land use change, and this data is contaminated. On the other hand, satellites provide comprehensive coverage of the Earth 24/7 for the last 20 years. And so what they have demonstrated is that there has been an almost imperceptible rise in temperature over this time.
But is there really much difference between temperatures in cities and that of the rest of the world?
I did studies in Winnipeg 25 years ago. We were measuring the heat island of the city of Winnipeg, and we found as much as 10 degrees Celsius difference between Portage and Main, which is supposedly the coldest part of Winnipeg, and the airport 8 kilometers away.
Most cities of the world are hotter than their surrounding environments. That has nothing to do with carbon dioxide, and it has everything to do with land use.
What about the relatively warm year 1998? Was that global warming or a naturally occurring event, such as El Nino?
Occasionally when it is warm, everybody is saying, oh, it is global warming, like 98. It is not global warming, it is just El Nino.
In 1997-98, we had a major El Nino develop at low latitude, and there was a tremendous amount of water vapor pumped up in the atmosphere, and we had a 1 degree Celsius spike around the world that was noted at that time that disappeared within a few months.
It's not even 25 years ago that the great threat was global cooling. You go back to the 70s and 76, and people like Ponte publishing books called The Cooling. And the scientific consensus then was that we were headed for cooling.
But surely climate change is happening. Do scientists have any doubt?
Climate always changes. It always has, and it always will, no matter what humans are doing.
And based on the paleoclimatic data that I and others have collected, it's obvious that climate is and always has been variable. In fact, the only constant about climate is change. It changes continually.
In a brochure sent to every household across the country, Environment Canada asserted that after 900 years of relatively constant temperature, the 20th century was suddenly warmer. The warmest in a millennium, they said. This was certainly different to what scientists had concluded before 1998.
Past climate researchers have found out that over much of the world, between about 1400 and in some places as late as 1900, there was a period of colder than average temperatures over many regions of the world called the Little Ice Age. And before that, there was a period of unusual warmth. So warming and cooling are the norm. The 20th century is not out of bounds compared to the past.
So that created a very familiar curve that appeared in the early IPCC reports. And then suddenly, in 1998, a study came out, which is now referred to as the MBH 98, because the three authors' names, the first one is the one that's spoken about the most, which is Mann, published a report in which they completely rejected that widely accepted temperature graph.
The MBH98 graph became known as the hockey stick curve, where the shaft of the stick was the relatively constant lower temperatures for the first 900 years of the past millennium, and the blade of the stick the reputed sudden temperature rise of the past century. Although Mann's research was never audited, the United Nations and environmentalists promoted it as the smoking gun that recent warming was unusual. Finally, in 2003, Canadian analyst Stephen McIntyre, in cooperation with Ross McKittrick of the University of Guelph, decided to take a closer look at the data.
We carried out an analysis of the results to see what happened when we recompiled the data, and got quite different answers. Instead of having an extraordinarily high 20th century, we had a 15th century value that was just as high as the 20th century. So the hockey stick disappeared. It's a computer programming error that yields these hockey sticks. This piece of the jigsaw puzzle needs to be removed before science can develop a proper understanding of the climate history of the last millennium.
Here's a study that appeared in the world's top science journal, and yet years went by and they never noticed that the data description that accompanied the paper was wrong, that there were very important methodological issues that weren't described in the paper.
Last year's Arctic Climate Impact Assessment made some very dramatic but highly unrealistic predictions. That the first graph to appear in the report is the hockey stick makes one naturally suspicious.
They made up what they were going to do beforehand and then chose whatever science they could find which they thought might support it. That's my view. They had another scare a few years ago because one of the people from the IPCC went on an Arctic cruise, you see, and he was absolutely amazed to find there was open sea. And he put an article in the New York Times saying, you know, this proves global warming. He had failed to notice that the Northwest Passage was first negotiated by a man called Roald Amundsen in 1906.
Recent research shows that 8,000 years ago, temperatures were 6 to 8 degrees higher in the Arctic than today, and that dramatic changes occurred in only a few decades. Nevertheless, polar bears and other Arctic wildlife obviously adapted and survived, and so are also not threatened today.
About 5,000 years ago, the world was much warmer than it is today, and warmer even than they're forecasting for the most extreme global warming forecasts.
We frequently hear that the incidence and severity of extreme weather, such things as hurricanes, blizzards, droughts, and floods, are increasing, and that global warming is the cause. As editor of Natural Hazards, a leading scientific journal in the field, Dr. Murty has reviewed hundreds of papers on the topic.
Not a single manuscript out of these hundreds ever claimed global warming as the reason for extreme weather. Not a single one. I do not see any evidence of actual either numbers, that is the frequency or intensity of extreme weather events increasing.
Similarly, extreme weather expert Dr. Madhav Kandekar demonstrates that such events are not on the rise in Canada. But what about the massive Quebec ice storm of 1998 that many people blame on climate change?
There's nothing to say that it's humans that were responsible. And also, we cannot say that in future we won't have that kind of ice storms. If all those meteorological conditions will fall in line again, we will have a severe ice storm of that magnitude, if not even bigger.
The argument is that we're going to have an increase of drought, and it's another part of the scare tactics. Well, more severe weather, more droughts, and so on. When you look at the long-term record, what you see is that droughts are cyclical. They do alternate, but you also see there are far worse droughts in the past than we've had in the modern record.
History shows that storm frequency and intensity is greatest in colder periods. The extreme weather of the Little Ice Age provides a good example.
The storms were much more dramatic. The storms would come in and wipe out villages along the northern coast.